On Christmas Eve 1968, 3 men orbited the moon and read from the book of Genesis to a billion people listening on Earth. The images they brought back, particularly the iconic Earthrise photograph, became symbols of human achievement and perspective. Apollo 8 was celebrated as a triumph of courage and engineering, the mission that proved humans could leave Earth orbit and survive the journey to another world. But that was the public story. The real story of Apollo 8 begins not in Houston or at Cape Kennedy, but in the windowless rooms of the National Reconnaissance Office and the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence. It begins with grainy photographs taken by Soviet tracking stations, with intercepted telemetry data, and with a growing alarm among American intelligence analysts about what the Soviets were preparing to do. If you're interested in the real story behind space programs, the technology that actually flew, the decisions that never made the press releases, and how space became a strategic domain, subscribe to SpaceCluster, like and turn on notification. We focus on what was built, why it mattered, and where it really led. Now, back to the story. In August 1968, NASA made a decision that shocked even its own engineers. Apollo 8, originally planned as an Earth orbital test of the Lunar Module in early 1969, would be completely redesigned. The Lunar Module would be removed entirely. Instead, the mission would send 3 astronauts to lunar orbit in December, just 4 months away. It would be only the second crewed flight of the Saturn V rocket, and the first time humans would leave the protective shield of Earth's magnetosphere. The official explanation was straightforward. The Lunar Module was behind schedule. Grumman was having problems with the ascent engine and the landing gear. Rather than waste time with another Earth orbital mission, NASA would leap forward, test the command and service module in deep space, practice lunar orbital navigation, scout landing sites for future missions, beat the Soviets to the moon, even if it was just to orbit it. This explanation was true, but it was not complete. Throughout 1968, American intelligence had been tracking a series of Soviet spacecraft launches under the designation Zond. These were not the familiar Soyuz capsules that orbited Earth. These were something different. Zond 4 had been launched in March, reaching a distance of 186,000 miles from Earth before returning. The mission ended in failure when the capsule's guidance system malfunctioned and the spacecraft had to be destroyed during re-entry. But the intent was clear. The Soviets were testing a circumlunar trajectory. Then came Zond 5 in September 1968. This mission succeeded. The spacecraft looped around the moon, photographed the far side, and returned to Earth. The capsule splashed down in the Indian Ocean and was recovered by a Soviet naval vessel. On board were biological specimens, wine flies, mealworms, plants, seeds, bacteria, and 2 Russian tortoises. All survived. The message was unambiguous. The Soviet Union had demonstrated a spacecraft capable of sending living creatures to the moon and bringing them back alive. Inside the National Security Council, the implications were being carefully assessed. The Zond spacecraft was a stripped-down version of the Soyuz, modified for a single purpose: a quick circumlunar flight. American analysts knew it could not land on the moon. It lacked the necessary propulsion and life support for a long-duration mission. But it could carry a single cosmonaut around the moon and return him to Earth as a hero. The first human to see the far side with his own eyes, the first human to leave Earth orbit. Another devastating propaganda victory for the Soviet Union, coming just months after the crushing of the Prague Spring, had reminded the world of the iron fist inside the velvet glove. This was the context in which NASA Administrator James Webb and Flight Director Chris Kraft presented the Apollo 8 proposal to Administrator Thomas Paine in August. This was the context in which Paine approved a mission profile that violated nearly every principle of incremental testing that had governed the space program since Mercury. This was why Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders found themselves training for a mission that did not exist 6 weeks earlier. But there was another dimension to the urgency: one that remained classified for decades after the mission flew. The far side of the moon is unique in the solar system. Because the moon is tidally locked to Earth, the same hemisphere always faces our planet. The opposite hemisphere, the far side, never does. This creates a zone of permanent radio silence. No television broadcasts, no military communications, no radar installations, no electronic noise of any kind from Earth can reach the far side. It is the most radio-quiet location within easy reach of human technology. For signals intelligence purposes, this makes it invaluable. Soviet interest in the far side had been evident since Luna 3 photographed it in 1959. Those first blurry images revealed a landscape dramatically different from the near side. Heavily cratered, almost devoid of the dark maria that characterized the face of the moon visible from Earth. Throughout the 1960s, Soviet scientists published papers discussing the scientific value of a radio telescope on the far side, shielded from Earth's electromagnetic interference. Some of these papers appeared in open scientific journals. Others were noted in classified intelligence assessments for their potential dual-use applications. A radio telescope on the far side could observe frequencies completely drowned out by human activity on Earth. But it could also intercept communications that its operators did not want anyone on Earth to know they were monitoring. Signals from American satellites, telemetry from missile tests, communications between naval vessels. All of this could be received, recorded, and relayed back to Earth without any possibility of detection or jamming from ground-based sources. The National Reconnaissance Office understood this. So did the National Security Agency. And so, when Zond 5 successfully demonstrated a lunar flyby capability, the question became urgent. What if the next step was not a propaganda stunt, but a reconnaissance mission? What if the Soviets were planning to place instruments on the far side, not for science, but for intelligence collection? Apollo 8's mission plan included extensive photography of the lunar surface. The official purpose was site selection for future landings. The astronauts would use a Hasselblad 500 EL camera with a 250mm lens to photograph potential landing zones in the equatorial regions. This was true. But the mission profile also called for photography of the far side, particularly the polar regions and the areas of highest elevation. These photographs had a secondary purpose that was not discussed in press conferences. They constituted the first strategic survey of potential sites for a listening post. Areas with line of sight to Earth for relay purposes. Regions with thermal characteristics suitable for long-term equipment survival. Terrain features that could provide natural shielding or support for antenna structures. All of this information would be valuable if the United States ever decided to place its own installations on the far side. And all of it would be necessary to understand what the Soviets might be planning if they got there first. Frank Borman understood this dimension of the mission. As a former Air Force pilot and instructor at the Aerospace Research Pilot School, he had security clearances that extended beyond the normal scope of astronaut activities. His pre-flight briefings included discussions that did not appear in the mission transcripts released to the public. He knew that some of the photography he would conduct had customers beyond the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston. On December 21, 1968, Apollo 8 lifted off from Launch Complex 39A at Cape Kennedy. The Saturn V performed flawlessly, placing the spacecraft into Earth orbit. 2 hours and 50 minutes later, the SIVB third stage reignited for the Trans-Lunar injection burn. For the first time in history, humans were leaving the gravitational dominance of Earth. The 3-day coast to the moon was uneventful. The crew conducted navigation checks, photographed Earth, and prepared for lunar orbit insertion. On December 24th, as the spacecraft swung behind the moon and lost radio contact with Earth, the Service Propulsion System engine fired for 4 minutes and 7 seconds, slowing Apollo 8 into an elliptical lunar orbit ranging from 60 to 169 miles altitude. When the spacecraft emerged from behind the moon and re-established contact, The first words transmitted were purely technical: confirmation of orbital parameters, system status, fuel remaining. But the subtext was historic. 3 humans were orbiting another world, and they had just become the first to see something no human had ever witnessed: Earthrise over the lunar horizon. Over the next 20 hours, the crew completed 10 orbits of the moon. They conducted the planned photography of potential landing sites: the Sea of Tranquility, where Armstrong and Aldrin would land 7 months later, and several backup locations. They photographed the far side in detail, capturing images of craters and highlands that had only been seen before in the low-resolution photographs from robotic probes. They also photographed areas that were not on the public mission timeline. The orbital mechanics of Apollo 8 were dictated partly by the need to return to Earth, partly by lighting conditions for photography, and partly by coverage requirements. The orbit was designed to provide visibility of specific regions during specific passes. Some of these regions were selected by geologists. Others were selected by analysts with different priorities. After the mission, the photographs were cataloged and distributed. Many went to the United States Geological Survey in Flagstaff, Arizona, where they were used to construct detailed maps for landing site selection. Others went to different agencies, where they were analyzed for different purposes. The resolution was not high enough for detailed terrain analysis, but it was sufficient for broad strategic assessment. Sufficient to identify potential sites. Sufficient to understand what would be required to place equipment there. Sufficient to recognize such equipment if it appeared in future reconnaissance imagery. Zond 6 launched on November 10, 1968, just weeks before Apollo 8. It successfully circled the moon and returned to Earth, but the landing was catastrophic. The cabin depressurized during re-entry, and the parachute deployed prematurely, causing the capsule to crash. If cosmonauts had been aboard, they would have died. The Soviets continued to insist publicly that they had no plans for a crewed circumlunar flight. But American intelligence knew better. The biological payloads on Zond 5 and the continued test flights made Soviet intentions clear. After Apollo 8's success, the Soviet Circumlunar program lost its purpose. There was no propaganda value in being second. Zond 7 flew in August 1969, after Apollo 11 had already landed on the moon. It was a perfect flight, demonstrating that the Soviets had finally solved the re-entry problems. But by then it did not matter. The political moment had passed. What did not pass was the strategic interest in the far side. Throughout the 1970s, both American and Soviet scientists continued to publish papers about the scientific value of far-side installations. The Soviets proposed elaborate plans for radio telescopes that would be serviced by cosmonauts from a nearby base. NASA studied concepts for automated instrument packages that could be delivered by Apollo-derived vehicles. None of these plans were implemented, but the studies continued. In the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, some of these studies were declassified. They revealed that both sides had seriously considered the military applications of lunar installations. Not weapons platforms, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 prohibited that, but reconnaissance and communications facilities. The far side was particularly attractive because it offered something that no satellite in Earth orbit could provide: a stable platform completely immune to electronic interference from Earth with unlimited line of sight to half the sky. The intelligence value of such a facility would be extraordinary. A signals intelligence station on the far side could intercept communications from satellites that its operators on Earth could not even detect, because the satellites would be below the horizon. It could monitor deep space communications from interplanetary probes, potentially gathering technical intelligence about propulsion systems, guidance algorithms, and mission profiles. It could serve as a relay station for covert communications, using the moon itself as a shield against detection. None of this was science fiction. The technology existed in the 1970s. The only barriers were cost and political will. Apollo 8's photography provided the foundation for understanding where such facilities could be placed and what would be required to build them. The mission's strategic reconnaissance value was never publicly acknowledged, but it was real. The photographs that appeared in National Geographic and on posters in classrooms around the world were the same photographs that appeared in classified briefing books at the National Reconnaissance Office. This dual purpose was not unique to Apollo 8. Every Apollo mission carried cameras and film specifications that were influenced by requirements from the intelligence community. The high-resolution mapping camera flown on later missions had performance characteristics that exceeded what was necessary for landing site selection, but were entirely appropriate for strategic reconnaissance. The orbital ground tracks were planned to provide coverage of areas that had scientific interest and other kinds of interest. None of this diminishes the courage of the astronauts or the achievement of the engineers who made the missions possible. But it adds a layer of context that is missing from the popular narrative. Apollo was not purely a scientific endeavor or a symbolic gesture. It was also an instrument of national power, and it was used as such. The Christmas Eve broadcast from lunar orbit, in which the crew read from Genesis, is remembered as a moment of unity and inspiration, and it was. But it was also a demonstration of capability, a message to Moscow and to the world that the United States had achieved something the Soviet Union had failed to do, despite years of effort and despite getting there first with robotic probes. The tragedy of Apollo 8's shadow history is not that it served strategic purposes. The tragedy is what did not happen afterward. The reconnaissance data was collected, the sites were identified, the technical requirements were understood, but the installations were never built. The far side remains as radio quiet today as it was in 1968. But now that silence is threatened by plans for commercial lunar development and satellite constellations that will fill even the far side with radio noise. The window of opportunity for a truly isolated listening post is closing. In another decade, there may be no place in the inner solar system that is free from human-generated electromagnetic interference. The unique strategic and scientific value of the far side will be lost, not because we lacked the capability to exploit it, but because we lacked the will. This is the pattern that repeats throughout the shadow history of the space race. Extraordinary capabilities developed at enormous cost, then abandoned before their full potential could be realized. Intelligence gathered, analyzed, filed away, and forgotten as political priorities shifted and budgets were cut. Apollo 8 proved that humans could travel to the moon and return safely. It provided the confidence needed to attempt a landing. It delivered strategic intelligence about potential far-side installations, and then, like so much of the Apollo program, it became a memory. The capability was demonstrated once and then allowed to atrophy. The Saturn V production lines were closed. The infrastructure was dismantled. The knowledge was retained only in aging documents and the fading memories of the engineers who built it. Today, as new powers plan their own lunar programs, the strategic questions that motivated Apollo 8's rushed schedule are relevant again. China has landed multiple probes on the far side, using a relay satellite to communicate with Earth. Their stated intentions are scientific, and there is no reason to doubt this. But the capability they are demonstrating has obvious dual-use potential. A relay satellite that can support a rover can support other kinds of payloads. A landing capability that can deliver scientific instruments can deliver other kinds of instruments. The photographs that Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders took in December 1968 are still being studied. Not by historians or space enthusiasts, but by analysts planning for scenarios that may unfold in the next decade. The strategic value of the far side has not diminished. If anything, it has increased as Earth orbit becomes more congested and more contested. Apollo 8 was sold to the public as a journey of exploration and inspiration. And it was. But it was also a reconnaissance mission, flown on an accelerated schedule because of intelligence about Soviet capabilities and concerns about Soviet intentions. The astronauts who flew it were not just explorers. They were also, whether they fully understood it at the time, intelligence collectors. This does not diminish their achievement. If anything, it adds weight to it. They were carrying out multiple missions simultaneously, serving multiple purposes under conditions of extraordinary risk. The fact that some of those purposes remained classified for decades does not make them less real or less important. What remains is the question of what we do with the knowledge they brought back. The far side of the moon is still there, still radio quiet, still offering unique capabilities for both science and intelligence. The photographs from Apollo 8 still show the same craters, the same highlands, the same potential sites. The technology to return there exists, though it must be rebuilt. The question is whether we have the strategic vision to recognize what was understood in 1968, that some places have value not just for what they are, but for what they enable. Apollo 8 gave us the first human perspective on that value. What we choose to do with that perspective will determine whether the mission's shadow history remains just history or becomes prologue to something new. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more stories where history, technology, and human ambition collide. Thanks for watching.